You've got mail.
3 words. A cheerful electronic voice. The sound that defined the 1990s internet. At its peak in 2000, that greeting welcomed nearly half of all Americans online. 27 million subscribers logging into AOL, the undisputed king of the digital age. Then came January 10th, 2000. America Online announced it would merge with Time Warner in a $350 billion deal, the largest merger in American corporate history. Steve Case, AOL's visionary co-founder, would become chairman. Gerald Levin, Time Warner's intellectual CEO, would run the combined empire. Wall Street exploded with excitement. This wasn't just a merger, it was the marriage of old media and new content and distribution. The analog past and digital future. AOL Time Warner would be unstoppable. 2 years later, the company reported a $99 billion loss. At the time, the largest annual loss in corporate history. AOL's stock value collapsed from $226 billion to $20 billion. Employees watched their retirement savings evaporate. Investors lost fortunes. Both CEOs were forced out. Business schools now teach the AOL Time Warner merger as a case study titled The Worst Deal in History. This is the story of how a company that brought America online, that made the internet feel friendly and accessible, that turned You've Got Mail into a cultural phenomenon, destroyed billions in shareholder value with a single catastrophic decision made at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble. But to understand how AOL fell, we must first understand how it rose. Because the company that executed history's worst merger was also one of the most innovative, successful, and culturally influential businesses of the 1990s. The story begins not with technology, but with a book. In 1979, Steve Case was a college student at Williams College when he read Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave. The book predicted a digital revolution, an era when people would live in an electronic cottage, getting information and communicating in entirely new ways through connected computers. Case, born in Honolulu in 1958 into a well-educated family, his father was a lawyer, his mother a teacher, was captivated. The internet, or something like it, was inevitable. It would transform everything. But when Case graduated in 1980, there were no internet companies to join, so he did what ambitious kids did. He went to work for major corporations, first Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, then Pizza Hut in Wichita, Kansas. He was miserable. These weren't his dreams. These weren't the future. In 1983, Case moved to Washington, D.C. and joined a startup called Control Video, which sold Atari games online. It promptly failed. But out of the ashes, Case, along with colleagues Jim Kimsey and Mark Sirif, founded something new. On May 24, 1985, they launched Quantum Computer Services, which would later become America Online. In 1985, only 3% of Americans were online, and those who were spent maybe an hour per week connected. The internet wasn't user-friendly. It was the domain of academics, government researchers, and hardcore hobbyists who could tolerate command line interfaces and cryptic protocols. Case saw the problem clearly. The internet would never reach mass adoption if it remained intimidating and technical. Someone needed to build an on-ramp, a gateway that made the digital world accessible, friendly, and useful. Quantum Computer Services started modestly, creating an online bulletin board for Commodore 64 computer owners. Case focused obsessively on 3 things: ease of use, affordability, and community. No complex commands, just point-and-click interfaces that were graphical, intuitive, simple, competitive pricing that regular families could afford, and not just information, but connection, chat rooms, forums, messaging that made the internet feel human. In 1991, Quantum Computer Services renamed itself America Online. The name was deliberate. This wasn't a tech company, it was a mission to bring America online. Development took years, but when AOL finally launched its signature features, they changed everything. The company offered on-demand access to millions of songs. Wait, that's wrong. Let me correct. AOL offered on-demand access to millions of pieces of content, email, chat rooms, and eventually grew to host millions of web pages through partnerships. But the real magic was the interface and the innovations that made the internet approachable. AOL pioneered instant messaging, allowing real-time chat when most online communication was asynchronous bulletin boards. While competitors like CompuServe and Prodigy remained technical and complicated, AOL felt approachable. Colorful graphics, clear buttons. You didn't need to be a programmer to use it. Starting in the early 1990s, AOL flooded America with free trial CDs, mailed to homes, inserted in magazines, handed out in stores. At one point, 50% of all CDs manufactured in the world were AOL sign-up discs. It became cultural wallpaper, inescapable. But the most iconic innovation was the sound,
"You've got mail."
Recorded in 1989 by voice actor Elwood Edwards, whose wife worked at Quantum. That cheerful greeting became the sound of the internet age. It was friendly, personal, exciting. Email wasn't just data transfer, it was connection, anticipation, possibility. In 1998, the phrase became the title of a Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan romantic comedy that grossed over $250 million worldwide. This wasn't just product placement, it was cultural validation. AOL had become so ubiquitous, so embedded in an American life, that Hollywood built an entire love story around it. On March 19, 1992, AOL became the first internet company to go public at $11.50 per share, raising $66 million. Over the next 8 years, AOL stock delivered an 11,616% return, the best performing stock of the entire 1990s. By 2000, the numbers were staggering. 27 million subscribers, nearly half of all American internet users, annual revenue of $6.9 billion, market capitalization of $160 billion, making it more valuable than Disney, more influential than any media company on earth. AOL wasn't just successful, it was the internet for millions of Americans. Before Google, before Facebook, before any of the platforms we now take for granted, there was AOL, the gateway, the on-ramp, the first friendly face of the digital age. Steve Case, who became CEO in 1991 at age 32, was hailed as a visionary. Business magazines put him on covers. He spoke at conferences with the authority of someone who'd seen the future and built it. But by 1999, cracks were forming. AOL's model, dial-up internet access through phone lines, was facing an existential threat: broadband. Cable companies were rolling out high-speed internet that didn't require AOL's software or subscription. Users could access the internet directly, bypassing AOL entirely. Case knew the company needed to evolve. The answer, he decided, was content. If AOL controlled both the distribution and the content, movies, music, news, entertainment, users would stay loyal even as broadband arrived. November 1999, a Manhattan hotel room, two CEOs with massive egos and bigger ambitions. Steve Case, 41, was riding high. AOL's stock was astronomically valued, $226 billion market cap at the peak of the dot-com bubble. Every analyst, every investor, every journalist treated internet companies like they'd suspended the laws of economics. AOL was the king. Gerald M. Jerry Levin, 61, was nearing the end of a legendary career. He'd transformed Time Warner from a fusty publishing company into a media empire. Magazines like Time, People, and Sports Illustrated, film studios including Warner Brothers, cable networks like HBO, CNN, and TBS, music labels, and theme parks. But he was haunted by a fear that the internet would make traditional media obsolete. Levin had been at the forefront of television innovation for decades. In 1972, as a young HBO executive, he'd convinced his bosses to transmit programming via satellite instead of videotape, a decision that created the modern cable industry. In 1995, he'd orchestrated Time Warner's $7.5 billion acquisition of Turner Broadcasting, bringing Ted Turner's empire under one roof. But the internet terrified him. What if AOL and AT&T formed a merger, controlling both content and the pipes? Time Warner would be crushed. Even worse, what if AOL launched a hostile takeover of Time Warner itself? With AOL's inflated stock valuation, it was theoretically possible. Levin was paranoid, Case was opportunistic. Over wine, they agreed, let's merge. AOL would provide the digital future. Time Warner would provide the content. Together, they'd be invincible. Critically, Levin kept the plan secret from his closest advisors. No one at Time Warner knew the deal was being negotiated. He later admitted, "The corporate executives, of which I was one, and the people who were closest with me didn't have any idea." January 10th, 2000. The press conference was staged like a presidential summit. Case and Levin stood together, beaming, announcing the merger, $350 billion in combined market value, $183 billion in stock and debt. AOL shareholders would own 55% of the new company. Time Warner shareholders would own 45%. The deal's terms were stunning. It was framed as a merger of equals, but the math told a different story. AOL, with $6.9 billion in revenue, was buying Time Warner, with $27 billion in revenue. A digital upstart was acquiring a media titan. Case called it a historic merger that will launch the next internet revolution. Levin declared it would create unprecedented and instantaneous access to every form of media. Wall Street went wild, the stock surged, analysts proclaimed the dawn of a new era. The Federal Communications Commission approved it on January 11, 2001. The merger officially closed later that day. AOL Time Warner Incorporated was born, the largest media company in history, the future incarnate. Here's what nobody wanted to admit in January 2000. The entire deal was predicated on AOL's stock price, which was wildly, insanely, catastrophically overvalued. The dot-com bubble had inflated tech stocks to absurd levels. Companies with no profits, no revenue, no viable business models were worth billions. Investors poured money into anything with .com in the name, assuming the internet would suspend economic reality forever. In March 2000, just 2 months after the merger was announced, the Nasdaq peaked. Then it began to fall. AOL's stock, once worth $95 per share at its peak, began collapsing. But the merger terms were locked in, based on valuations from January. Time Warner shareholders were trading their stable, profitable company for shares in a company whose valuation was evaporating in real time. By the time the deal officially closed in January 2001, the economic landscape had transformed. The euphoria of the late 90s tech boom had been replaced by recession, skepticism, and a brutal reckoning. AOL Time Warner was born into the perfect storm. From day one, AOL Time Warner was a disaster of corporate culture. Time Warner executives, sophisticated, experienced, rooted in traditional media, looked down on the AOL transplants as unsophisticated internet cowboys who'd gotten lucky during a bubble. AOL executives, young, aggressive, fluent in digital, viewed Time Warner as dinosaurs clinging to dying business models. The legendary fiefdoms of Time Inc., Warner Brothers, CNN, and HBO refused to cooperate. Rather than embracing the merger's potential, each division protected its territory. Cable divisions, Time Warner Cable and Roadrunner Broadband, refused to make AOL their default platform or prioritize it. If the very broadband services owned by AOL Time Warner wouldn't promote AOL, how could the merger possibly work? Ted Turner, the legendary media mogul who'd sold Turner Broadcasting to Time Warner in 1995 and become the company's largest individual shareholder, was furious. He watched his fortune evaporate as AOL Time Warner stock collapsed. Turner later said he'd lost 80% of his net worth in the merger, billions gone. At board meetings, tensions boiled over. Turner openly criticized Levin. Case tried to orchestrate Levin's ouster, but other board members rebuffed him. In 2002, federal regulators launched an investigation into AOL's accounting practices. The findings were damning. AOL had improperly inflated advertising revenue in the years leading up to the merger. The company had booked round-trip transactions, deals where AOL bought advertising from other companies, and those companies bought advertising from AOL, inflating revenue on both sides without real economic value. Other schemes involved booking long-term ad deals as immediate revenue. The revelations forced AOL Time Warner to restate earnings. Lawsuits followed. The SEC got involved. Trust, already fragile, shattered completely. In 2002, AOL Time Warner reported a $99 billion loss, at the time the largest annual loss in American corporate history. The loss came primarily from a goodwill write-down, accounting speak for admitting that the assets acquired in the merger, primarily AOL, were worth far, far less than what had been paid. Shareholder wealth, $200 billion in market value, simply evaporated. Employees who'd been paid in stock watched their retirement savings vanish. Workers who'd believed in the vision, who'd weathered the integration chaos, who'd defended the merger, were left with nothing. Fall 2001, Gerald Levin, exhausted and blamed by everyone, announced he would resign effective May 2002. He later admitted he'd been unable to regain the rhythm at the merged company. His replacement was Dick Parsons, a Time Warner veteran and steady hand. But Parsons had no magic fix. The damage was structural, cultural, financial, unfixable. Bob Pittman, AOL's president and COO, widely seen as Levin's heir apparent, was passed over. Embittered, he left in 2002. January 2003, Steve Case resigned as chairman. The man who'd co-founded AOL, who'd built it into the internet's gateway, who'd orchestrated the biggest merger in history, was forced out. In his resignation letter, Case wrote, "It is clear to me that the company will be better served by a single leader who can accelerate progress." The merger's architect had become its scapegoat. For years, executives debated whether to keep AOL or cut it loose. In 2009, AOL and Time Warner officially separated. In a symbolic moment captured by photographers, workers removed the AOL letters from the Time Warner Center signage in New York City. Empire building in reverse, the separation was anticlimactic. AOL, once worth $226 billion, was spun off as an independent company worth about $2.5 billion. Time Warner, liberated from its digital anchor, continued limping along until AT&T acquired it in 2018 for $85 billion. Business schools dissect the AOL Time Warner merger endlessly. The lessons are painful and clear. First, timing was everything. The merger was announced in January 2000 at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble. The Nasdaq crashed 2 months later. AOL's valuation was built on irrational exuberance, Wall Street's collective delusion that internet companies had suspended economic gravity. Had Levin waited even 6 months, the deal would never have happened at those terms. Second, AOL used its inflated stock as currency to buy Time Warner, but that stock's value was a mirage, unsustainable, untethered to actual profits. When the bubble burst, Time Warner shareholders realized they'd traded real assets for monopoly money. Third, in practice, cultures clashed catastrophically. Time Warner's divisions had operated as independent kingdoms for decades. HBO didn't play nice with Warner Brothers CNN, guarded its autonomy fiercely. Forcing them to cooperate with AOL, which they viewed as inferior, was impossible. Fourth, distribution proved not to be destiny. The entire merger thesis depended on AOL controlling distribution, internet access. But broadband killed that model. Users switched to cable and DSL providers that didn't require AOL software. AOL's subscriber base peaked in 2002 at 27 million, then began a long, slow decline. By 2010, only 4 million people still used AOL dial-up. Fifth, the merger demonstrated the danger of letting two CEOs decide the fate of hundreds of thousands. Levin and Case negotiated the merger in secret over wine without exposing the idea to advisors who might have raised objections. This was ego-driven deal-making, two men convinced of their own brilliance, making a $350 billion bet without proper diligence. After the split from Time Warner in 2009, AOL limped along as an independent company. It acquired the Huffington Post in 2011 for $315 million, trying to pivot to digital media. In 2013, it bought TechCrunch and several other blogs. In 2015, Verizon acquired AOL for $4.4 billion, primarily for its digital advertising technology. In 2017, Verizon bought Yahoo for $4.5 billion and merged it with AOL to create Oath, later rebranded as Verizon Media, then sold to Apollo Global Management in 2021 for $5 billion. AOL still exists as a brand. Its email service still has millions of users, mostly older Americans who've had their AOL email addresses for decades and see no reason to change. The dial-up service still operates for a small number of subscribers, but AOL as a cultural force, as the gateway to the internet, as the friendly voice saying, "You've got mail," that AOL died long ago. Steve Case left the board in 2005 to focus on his venture capital firm, Revolution LLC, which he'd founded after resigning from AOL Time Warner. Revolution invested in companies like Zipcar, Living Social, and Sweetgreen. Case became an advocate for entrepreneurship outside Silicon Valley, traveling across America as part of his Rise of the Rest initiative. He wrote 2 books and joined philanthropic efforts with his wife, Jean Case, through the Case Foundation. In 2010, they joined the Giving Pledge. Case never publicly apologized for the merger, though he did later advocate for undoing it. His net worth stabilized around $1.5 to $2 billion, still wealthy but far from the fortune he would have had if AOL had remained independent. Gerald Levin resigned in 2002, took a $1 million per year consulting contract from AOL Time Warner, divorced his wife of 32 years, and largely disappeared from public life. Then, in later years, something unexpected happened. Levin owned his mistake. In interviews and public statements, he acknowledged the merger was catastrophic and took responsibility. "I was a strange person," he once admitted. "It is absolutely true that I plotted the departure of rivals." Levin died on March 13, 2024, at age 84. Ted Turner, who lost billions in the merger, became one of its most vocal critics. He blamed Levin and Case for destroying shareholder value and called the deal the worst mistake of my life. Turner, who'd been Time Warner's vice chairman and largest individual shareholder, saw his net worth collapse from over $9 billion to around $2 billion. The AOL Time Warner merger is invoked constantly in business discussions, a cautionary tale, a warning, a punchline. It appears in business school case studies titled "The Worst Deal in History" in CNBC lists of worst American CEOs of all time, where Jerry Levin made the list. The merger proved several uncomfortable truths: that bubbles warp judgment, that culture beats strategy, that distribution advantages are temporary, that speed kills when you skip proper diligence, and that the media is complicit when journalists and analysts cheerlead deals without asking hard questions. But perhaps the deepest lesson is this: even the most successful, visionary, innovative companies can destroy themselves with a single decision. AOL had brought America online, created the first mass-market internet service, and pioneered online community. None of that saved it from hubris. Despite the catastrophic merger, AOL's positive legacy remains undeniable, woven into the fabric of how we experience the internet today. Before AOL, the internet was intimidating. Command lines, technical jargon, a world for experts who understood protocols and could tolerate frustration. AOL built the on-ramp that changed everything. It made email accessible to grandparents who'd never touched a computer. It created chat rooms where strangers became friends, where geography dissolved and connection flourished. It proved that online communities weren't just possible, they mattered deeply to how humans would live in the digital age. As FCC chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel reflected in 2024, AOL not only accounted for half of all internet users. Its iconic greeting, "You've got mail," was so pervasive in the culture, it became the name of a hit movie. That sentence captures something profound. AOL wasn't just a service, it was a cultural phenomenon that transcended technology and entered the language itself. Long before Facebook mapped our social graphs, before Twitter gave us 280 characters to declare our thoughts, before any modern social network existed, there was AOL. Its chat rooms became the first mass digital gathering places. Instant Messenger created the template for real-time online conversation. Member profiles let people curate digital identities. Forums built communities around shared interests. The @AOL.com email address became as ubiquitous as a phone number, a digital identity that signaled you were part of the connected world. The subscription model AOL pioneered, a simple monthly fee for unlimited access, became the blueprint every digital service would follow. Netflix streaming your favorite shows, Spotify playing your playlist, Amazon Prime delivering packages and content, all of them trace their economic DNA back to AOL's insight that people would pay predictably for ongoing access rather than per-use fees. The model that seems obvious now was revolutionary then, and AOL proved it worked at massive scale. And then there's the phrase itself, "You've got mail." Those 3 words transcended their functional purpose, a notification, and became cultural shorthand for the entire internet age. Even people who never logged into AOL knew that greeting. It represented possibility, the thrill of connection, the promise that technology could bring people together across distances that once felt insurmountable. When a major Hollywood film took that phrase as its title and built a romantic comedy around it, AOL had achieved something few brands ever do. They'd contributed a phrase to the cultural lexicon that would outlive the company itself. That cheerful voice still greets millions of AOL email users every day, mostly older Americans who've held onto their addresses for decades. For them, it's nostalgia, habit, continuity in a world that changes too fast. For the rest of us, it's a ghost. A reminder of what once was. A sound from the past. AOL brought America online. It made the internet friendly, accessible, communal. It created the first mass digital gathering place where strangers became friends, where email felt like magic, where logging on felt like coming home. Steve Case and Gerald Levin believed they were creating the future. They were right about one thing: the merger was historic, just not in the way they'd hoped. In the end, AOL's story is both triumph and tragedy. The company that taught America to say "you've got mail" is remembered as much for the greeting as for the goodbye. The moment when ambition outpaced wisdom, when vision became delusion, when the future they promised turned into the disaster they created. The internet moved on, the world moved on, but the lessons remain echoing like that cheerful voice, "You've got mail." Only this time the message is a warning,